Resuming debate.
Honourable member from Wellington, Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, since the Peace of Westphalia was concluded in 1648, the international system has developed into modern nation states and international law. In the almost 400 years since those treaties were established, the world has created nation states that conduct relations based on international law. And that international system further developed after 1945, a period during which Canada was instrumental in creating the current rules-based international system that has ensured our relative peace and security here at home. Our forebears here in Canada well understood the need for a rules-based system because Canada paid a high price in the Great War and in the Second World War in defense of freedom, democracy, and the rule of law. Some 60,000 Canadian soldiers died during the Great War. Some 40,000 Canadian soldiers died during the Second World War. Over 100,000 Canadian soldiers gave their lives in 2 world wars, and hundreds of thousands of more were injured physically and mentally, and came home and suffered for the duration of the rest of their lives. And as a result of that suffering, our forebears understood the need for a rules-based international system that would not only ensure the peace and security of Canadians here at home, but the peace and security of all humanity abroad. That rules-based system, which we have enjoyed for 80-some years, has given us that relative peace and security. And I want to highlight some very, very stark statistics to illustrate what I am talking about. There is no doubt that millions of people around the world today have suffered and are suffering. But, Mr. Speaker, that pales in comparison to the bloodshed and the suffering before 1945. Life before 1945, for the vast majority of humanity, was nasty, brutish, and short. In the First World War, in the Great War, some 40 million people died. That's right, 40 million. In the Second World War, some 75 million people died. That scale of human misery and suffering and death has largely been avoided because of the rules-based international system that Canada was instrumental in founding in 1945. And those deaths from those 2 wars, that's the small part of it before 1945. They were the smallest part of the deaths before 1945. In the period before 1945, people just didn't suffer because of conflict and war. Hundreds of millions more suffered and died because of extreme poverty. 2/3 of all humanity before 1945 lived in extreme poverty. Today, it's only about 1 in 7 people on the planet live in extreme poverty. In fact, the number of people living in extreme poverty today is not only much smaller as a proportion of the planet's humanity, but it is smaller in absolute numbers of people suffering prior to 1945. Despite the massive growth, the trebling, quadrupling of the world's population in the last half-century and more. The rules-based international system for trade and investment has significantly reduced that suffering and increased prosperity. It's that rules-based system that has led to a huge drop in extreme poverty and a massive increase in prosperity for peoples around the world. It is the rules-based system that has led to a significant drop from deaths and suffering from war. It is a system that states like the People's Republic of China, the Russian Federation, and the Islamic Republic of Iran want to dismantle. They do not want this system, and they have been very explicit about this in their speeches and in their declarations. And they would rather us revert to a pre-1945 world where power determines relations between states. And none of us, Mr. Speaker, should want to return to that world. An essential part of the international rules-based system is international humanitarian law, otherwise known as the law of armed conflict. International humanitarian law is the heart of what we are debating tonight in this House. It is whether or not actors in the conflict in the Middle East today are acting in accordance with international humanitarian law, acting in accordance with the law of armed conflict. Under international humanitarian law, states have the right to defend themselves. On October 7th of last year, a liberal democratic state was attacked. It was attacked by Hamas. On that day, 2,500 Hamas terrorists invaded a sovereign state, breaking through the sovereign 1949 armistice border and killing over 1,100 innocent civilians. It must be repeated that these 1,100 civilians were not killed inadvertently, were not killed accidentally. These 1,100 civilians weren't killed incidental to the targeting of armed combatants or military objectives. These innocent civilians were the target. These 1,100 innocent civilians were deliberately and systemically targeted and murdered by Hamas in what constituted a massive war crime. They were gunned down execution style, just like the mobile killing squads of the Nazis, the Einsatzkommando, who executed some 1.5 million Jews during the Action campaign in 1941 in Eastern Europe. On October 7th last year, whole families were executed. Innocent babies were killed in their cribs, and the dead were mutilated. Some of the dead were paraded through the streets of Gaza. There were Canadians amongst those deliberately killed, and there were Canadians amongst those deliberately taken hostage. And since Hamas began its attack on Israel last October 7th, Hezbollah and the Islamic Republic of Iran have joined in. Hezbollah has launched some 8,000 rockets at Israel over the last 12 months, forcing the displacement of some 60,000 civilians from the north of Israel to the south, essentially making northern Israel a vacant zone for civilians. These civilians have had to leave their homes and their communities, and the government of the State of Israel has had to evacuate them out of Israeli territory to the south. And today, Iran launched yet another attack on the State of Israel by launching some 200 ballistic missiles. Mr. Speaker, all states have a responsibility to defend their citizens and to defend their territory. The State of Israel is no different. Israel is at war. This is a legal war under international humanitarian law. The war the State of Israel is conducting against Hamas, against Hezbollah, and against the Islamic Republic of Iran under international humanitarian law is a justifiable war. It is a justifiable war against two terrorist groups and a state that sponsors terrorism. Israel has the right to prosecute this war under international humanitarian law and to prosecute this war to its conclusion that the State of Israel has so determined, and ensure that Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Islamic Republic of Iran no longer threaten the citizens of its state or its territory. Canada did the same thing during the Second World War. We defended our citizens and our territories against a hostile threat. And the State of Israel has the right to do the same. Mr. Speaker, millions of civilians are suffering because of the war in Gaza, in Lebanon, and in Israel. And we mourn the loss of innocent civilians, particularly women and children. The combatants in this conflict need to ensure that they distinguish between combatants and civilians and take all feasible precaution in the targeting of military objectives to minimize harm to civilians and civilian objects. But ultimately, the solution to the conflict and the war in the Middle East is for Hezbollah and Hamas to lay down their arms to protect innocent Lebanese and Palestinians that for too long have been subject to these brutal terrorist entities for decades. For too long, civilians, Palestinians, Lebanese, Syrians, Iranians, have been the victims of Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Islamic regime in Iran. For too long, these regimes have suppressed democracy, human rights and freedoms, and the rule of law through brute force. For too long, millions of Palestinians, Lebanese, Syrians, and Iranians have suffered. If there's any ray of hope in recent events, it is that they mark the end of the terrorist groups Hamas and Hezbollah and the beginning of the end of the Islamic Republic of Iran's hold on much of the region. Canada is a Western liberal democracy. What is going on in the Middle East is a clash between a rising authoritarianism backed by states such as the People's Republic of China, the Russian Federation, and the Islamic Republic of Iran, and democracies such as Taiwan, Ukraine, and the State of Israel. And in that clash between a rising authoritarianism and democracies, there is no question on which side of the line Canada should stand. Canada must stand for democracy. Canada must stand for human rights and freedoms. And Canada must stand for the rule of law as it is articulated in international humanitarian law. Conservatives support the State of Israel. The State of Israel is a liberal, democratic state. It is also the homeland of the Jewish people. It has the right to defend itself. It has the right to use all legal means necessary under international humanitarian law to ensure its peace and security. Israel, like Ukraine and Taiwan, is at the front lines of a clash that is unfolding before our eyes, a clash that we did not anticipate a decade ago, a clash that has unfolded over the last several years. In that rising clash between two very different models of governance, there is no doubt where Canada's interests and where Canada's values lie. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagotte. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I listened attentively to my colleague's speech. I think there are several things, but there was a historical portion that could be subject to debate if we talk about this global order that was built after the Second World War. Obviously, there were some gray areas. Otherwise, there wouldn't be what we see today, or some dark areas, rather. But all of this is another debate historically. But now, nevertheless, the question, I think, well, you cannot just limit the question to say it's a democratic state. We support it, period. Obviously, they do have the right to exist. That's fundamental. Obviously, Israel is a democracy, and obviously, Israel is also has the right to defend itself. But now, Netanyahu's policy, well, just because they're a democracy, his policies are not the same as that of Isaac Rabin. What does he suggest to get out of this situation? The Honourable Member for Wellington, Halton Hills.
Si, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague, my honourable colleague, for his question. Canada is a democracy, of course, but at the same time, we're not perfect. We have a lot of problems here, and it's the same thing with other democracies worldwide, such as the case with Israel. It's not a perfect democracy. There are problems domestically, but it's not up to us to pronounce our opinions about problems in other democracies. There are problems in North America in the south, but it's not up to Canada to give its opinions on problems in the U.S. In my opinion, we are clearly a liberal democracy that is based on Western values, and it's the same thing with Israel. And we must support this state because it is. Sorry, I would ask the honourable member to wrap up his answer quickly. Quickly, please. Because there is a big war between democracies and authoritarian states. I'd like to thank the member for Wellington Halton Hales. And I just remind all members, when you're going to answer your question, please adjust. Look at me and I will tell you how much time you have, so make sure you don't go over. The member for Edmonton Strathcona.
For his intervention, I find it shocking that he wasn't able to find even one example of how Netanyahu's administration could be criticized. But, you know, I'm interested. He talked about international law. He talked about rule-based international systems. Clearly, he would know that almost every single international expert has said that the actions of this Netanyahu government have reduced the rules-based international order. So I'd like him to tell me very clearly, what is the Conservative Party's position in terms of international justice? Would a Conservative government support the ICC and ICJ calls for justice that we've seen come through?
The honourable member from Wellington Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my honourable colleague for her question. I disagree with the premise of her question. I've seen no credible reports that indicate that the State of Israel has contravened international humanitarian law. I've also seen no credible reports that the State of Israel has violated customary international law.
I'm going to ask the honourable member from Edmonton Strathcona to please to hold her time until she has an opportunity to speak when she's recognized. And I insist this for all members. I think all members, this is a very sensitive issue, and I congratulate all members for being very patient with each other as we explore a very sensitive issue. The honourable member from Wellington Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, I've seen no credible reports of the State of Israel violating either international humanitarian law or customary international law. The number of civilians that have been unfortunately killed in this conflict is not an arbitrary determinant as to whether or not a state is complying with international law. I remind this House that the Allies during the Second World War killed 400,000 German civilians, and that was not a war crime. Those were incidental to the targeting of military objectives. And I remind this House, Mr. Speaker, that the Luftwaffe killed 40,000 Londoners during the Second World War. And every one of those deaths, Mr. Speaker, was a war crime because the Luftwaffe deliberately targeted the civilian areas of East London and not military objectives. So, Mr. Speaker, the number of civilian deaths, however unfortunate, is not the determinant as to whether or not international humanitarian law has been breached.
The honourable member from Winnipeg South Centre.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. I listened as a former history teacher with great interest to the remarks from my colleague across the way. I actually want to shift for a moment, Mr. Speaker, to what's happening here domestically by virtue of what's happening overseas. I'm wondering if my colleague can comment on some of the trends that we have seen here in Canada whereby by virtue of the way that one feels about the current government of the State of Israel, there have been substantial implications for Jews, such as myself and those I represent across Canada. Can he speak, for example, to some of the calls for boycotting of so-called Zionist businesses and how he believes that this is a problem for us here in Canada as we try in our diaspora communities to deal with the impacts of what's happening overseas? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Wellington Halton Hills.
I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for the question. I think the federal government should show leadership in tackling the heinous rise in anti-Semitism in our country, in tackling the disorder in our public spaces and in our streets that are targeting Jews, that are targeting synagogues, and that are targeting Jewish institutions such as schools. And I believe that the Public Safety Minister should convene a federal provincial Solicitors General meeting in order to come to an agreement amongst the 10 provinces and the federal government that directives will be issued of general application to law enforcement in this country, that laws will be enforced against those that would use public disorder in our streets to target the Jewish community. And that's the kind of leadership that I would expect from a government of Canada, leadership that I am convinced will be in place if Conservatives form the next government.
Hear, hear.
The honourable member from Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to start by sharing how much I agree with the member for Wellington-Halton Hills on the importance of the rules-based order. Appreciate his focus on international humanitarian law. Agree with him on condemning Hamas for their terrorist attack of October the 7th. But my question to him is about all parties following international humanitarian law. He was looking for examples earlier. I'll cite with him some here. Amnesty International, January 2019, quote, Israel's policy of settling its civilians in occupied Palestinian territory and displacing the local population contravenes fundamental rules of international humanitarian law. That was prior to October 7th. If he's looking for post-October 7th, January 26th, the International Court of Justice ordered Israel to take actions, 6, to prevent acts of genocide. Clearly, we would agree that's against international humanitarian law. Is he going to call for international humanitarian law to be followed by all parties or only some?
The honourable member from Wellington-Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, first, I want to thank the member for the question. Second, the International Court of Justice did not find that Israel had committed genocide. It just asked the State of Israel to comply with the 1948 Genocide Convention, which Israel is in the process, Israel has been doing. Secondly, with respect to Amnesty International's interpretation of international humanitarian law, I disagree, and with their interpretation of the facts on the ground. At the end of the day, there have been no credible reports that I have read that indicate that the State of Israel has committed war crimes or has had grave breaches of customary international law. What I do know is that the terrorist group Hamas, in taking the hostages, some 250 hostages last October 7th, did commit war crimes. That is obviously a war crime. The Hamas, in executing and targeting some 1,100 innocent civilians, also committed war crimes. Those are findings that I think the international community has agreed to, that adhere to Hamas, and for which they should be held responsible.
Well done.
A very brief question and a very brief answer from the member from Thornhill.
Mr. Speaker, I want to know the member's thoughts on the very idea that this government, who just reaffirmed its commitment to funding UNRWA, had the leader of Hamas in Lebanon, who was an UNRWA school teacher, just buried in Hamas regalia today. What does he think of that?
The honourable member from Halton Hills has 20 seconds to respond.
Mr. Speaker, I think the Government of Canada should suspend immediately all funding to UNRWA. I think it's clear that UNRWA has a problem with a certain number of employees that are supporters of Hamas and Hezbollah, that UNRWA has a problem with some of its facilities being used as staging grounds for terrorist activities, and that's why the Government of Canada should immediately suspend funding.
Good.